Welcome back everybody to another MOTOBOB video, where today we finally have the full specs for one of the most anticipated bikes of the year, Husqvarna's Norden 901. So in this video we'll go over all of the details and I'll tell you absolutely everything you need to know about this awesome looking middleweight adventure motorcycle. Now if the specs seem somewhat familiar, that's because it's heavily based upon the KTM 890 Adventure. That's because KTM own Husqvarna and this is generally how they work together. Take the Vitpillen and Svartpillen 701s for example, they're both based upon the KTM 690 Duke, but Husqvarna have reskinned it in their own distinctive visual style and I absolutely love what they do with their bikes aesthetically. Same for the 401s and the 125, they're based upon the 390 and 125 Dukes. And so that's what they've done again here with a massive visual reworking of the 890 Adventure. Now the 890 is a brilliant bike, I'll link to my review in the description below. So the fact that they're basically the same is massively a good thing in my opinion, but the Norden does get a couple of accessories as standard and a few tweaks to the spec that should make it the better off-roader. We'll start with the engine though, an 889cc parallel twin with a 435-degree firing interval to give it the sound and feel of KTM's larger LC8 75-degree V-twin. Performance figures are pretty decent with 105 horsepower made up at 8,000 RPM and 100 Nm of peak torque at 6,500. It might not sound like loads compared to a large capacity adventure bike, but honestly, especially solo riding without luggage, it's plenty enough for a bike of this size to have a lot of fun. When you start to push it, it really does have a feel of the 890 Duke, which is one of my favourite sporty nakeds. It's essentially the same engine, just in a different state of tune. But as well as being able to do the sporty road riding, an adventure bike has to be a bit of an all-rounder, and so you want it to feel good in the lower revs, especially if you're doing a lot of off-roading. Thankfully, when KTM updated the 790, as well as adding that extra capacity, they also added a bit of mass to the crankshaft to give it more inertia and therefore make it feel more torquey in the low revs. And yeah, to me it really paid off. It's a super versatile engine that can do that stuff as well as the revvy fun riding. I also thought it was surprisingly smooth, and again with an adventure bike you might want to do longer distance and touring. Clearly you don't want any excessive vibes, it can get really wearying very quickly, and so they fitted it with two balancer shafts, one in front of the crankshaft and then one at the top of the engine between the camshafts. Massively paid off. I thought it was a very silky ride. On top of this stuff you get a ride-by-wire throttle that opens up a few riding modes, we'll talk about those in a moment, and also a slip assist clutch, so it prevents the rear wheel from locking up on aggressive downshifts but also feels super light at the lever. There's a quick shifter accessory for the 890 Adventure but it's 350 quid, so a nice bonus for the Norden is that it gets that feature as standard. Last up on the engine, the fuel economy, 4.5 litres per 100 km travelled, so about 60 miles per gallon in UK gallons, which I think is pretty decent. It also gets a 19-litre tank, so although that's a litre less than the equivalent KTM's, you can still expect about 250 miles between stops, so for long distance and touring, that seems fairly competitive. The other thing about the tank is it hangs down at either side of the bike, so that helps to keep the weight of the fuel low, and I found that it made the 890 feel like really accessible. Other adventure bikes where you've got a full tank and it's placed up high, and if you've got luggage and it's got a tall seat height and you're not especially tall like me, they can feel a bit sketchy at lower speeds, but the 890, it couldn't have been any different. Now the Norden is listed in the spec sheet as 204 kilograms in total weight without fuel, but even fueled up I reckon it'd feel much lighter than the equivalent bike but with the tank in the regular position. You also get a couple of side benefits with that tank, so you can make the seat super long, which gives the rider loads of space to move around, and with it being so low it actually protects your legs a little from wind and spray. But onto the chassis, and again it's largely the same as the 890 Adventure, so the engine acts as a stress member, you've got a steel frame wrapped around it, a steel trellis subframe, and then an open lattice aluminium swing arm. Suspension is provided by KTM's own brand WP with the Apex 43mm upside down fork and an Apex shock at the rear. The fork is compression and rebound adjustable with some easy to use clickers on the top of the forks, whereas the shock is rebound and preload adjustable. So like I say, pretty much the same as the 890 Adventure, but they did make a couple of tweaks, like mild tweaks to the geometry, and the suspension, it actually gets a little more travel, so 220mm at the front, 215 at the rear, as opposed to 200 front and rear on the 890. In fact, the whole bike sits a little taller, there's 19mm more ground clearance, and the seat height is adjustable between 854 and 874mm, as opposed to 830 and 850. That's still not quite as tall as the super off-road focused R version, version, but clearly they've set the Norden up for a little more off-road capability than the standard 890. Ergonomically, you get a tapered handlebar that's adjustable between 6 positions with 30mm of front to rear movement, the footrests get removable rubber inserts, and the brake pedal gets a reversible tip, so between all of those adjustments and the 2 seat heights, you should be able to find a position that's comfy on the road and then also for standing and off-roading. As for the wheels, they're spokes with a 21-inch front and an 18 rear, and you get tubeless Pirelli Scorpion Rally STR tyres fitted as standard. So again, with that wheel diameter and the choice of tyres, it's just got that extra bit of off-road bias versus the KTM. Braking is taken care of by J-Juan with a pair of radially mounted 4-pot calipers on 320mm discs at the front and a 2-pot caliper on a 260mm disc at the rear. Now, J-Juan might not be the fanciest name in town, but realistically they make braking equipment for so many other brands that these are as good as any other. In the real world, I found the braking on the 890 Adventure to be excellent with plenty of feel and plenty of stopping power. Tech-wise, this bike is pretty comprehensive with all the bells and whistles that you'd expect from a modern day adventure bike. It gets a 5-inch TFT display, which of course is highly similar to the 890 Adventures, but with Husqvarna's own branding and layouts. Under the hood, there's a 6-axis inertial measurement unit, and that feeds lean data into the cornering rider aids like ABS and traction control. Both of those are tied into the riding modes, as well as throttle response and engine map, and so street is the standard mode, whereas rain reduces the throttle and engine response and quickens up the traction control intervention. Off-road offers smooth throttle delivery as well, but it delays the traction control to allow for moderate levels of slide. It also removes the lean sensitivity to allow the bike to use berms when turning, and anti-wheelie is also disabled to allow the front wheel to lift over obstacles. Lastly, an optional Explorer mode allows the rider to dial in the settings to their own exact preference. Now, MSR is also present, so mode to slip regulation. This sort of complements the slipper clutch, so it keeps engine braking in check. If it detects the rear wheel braking traction, it just gives the engine a bit of gas to bring it back into check. Cruise control also comes as standard on this bike, which is an absolute must for me on any bike intended for distance riding. For reference, that's a 225 quid extra on the standard 890. Now, phone connectivity is also available, but this one isn't as standard. If you upgrade to it, you can connect to a phone and a headset and then control music and calls from the switchgear, as well as turn-by-turn nav on the TFT dash. Now, you also get LED lighting all round, and there's a striking daytime running light at the front. Those peripheral lights are also as standard, and there's a 12-volt charging socket in the cockpit to power any devices. Now, Husqvarna list a bunch of accessories for this bike to enhance its abilities, especially with regards to long distance riding and touring. There's hard luggage from Touratech, as well as some neat looking soft luggage options, and then there's a high windscreen, heated seats, and heated grips, all of which would be highly appreciated in colder weather. If the seat height is a little on the tall side for you, there's a 22mm lowering kit, and they say it preserves the bike's dynamics as it was designed in-house. Last up, there's also an Akropovich slip-on exhaust accessory, which they say gives you a substantial weight saving. Now, a quick word on the styling, because this is clearly where the bike massively diverges from the KTM. It is all down to personal taste, but I've never really been a big fan of KTM styling. The orange color scheme and insectoid headlights just don't really do it for me, so it's always been a good thing that KTM offer essentially the same bikes but in really awesome looking packages. I'm not sure the Norden looks quite as sharp as the concept back at EICMA in 2019, but it's still a big improvement on the KTM for me. Not only am I a big fan of the lighting, which really defines the front end, but I also like what they've done with the paint scheme and the choice of colors and the contour line graphics. But like I say, this is personal preference, so I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below, and which one is the best looking, the Husky or the KTM. Now, unfortunately, at the time of writing, they've yet to announce a UK price, but you'd imagine with the quick shifter and cruise control as standard, it's going to come in a little higher than the 11 grand of the 890 Adventure. I'd imagine around the 12 grand mark. And so how does that stack up with the competition? Well, you'd have to say that the main bikes it's going up against are the Tiger 900 Rally at 12,100 and the BMW F850 GS Adventure at about 11 grand. I'd also throw the Africa Twin in the mix at 13 grand because although it is a larger capacity bike than the rest, it's pretty similar on power and capability. But the thing with these adventure bikes is there's so much spec and tech that it's really difficult to compare them like for like, especially in a quick video like this. So I reckon I'll do a proper deep dive head-to-head in the next few weeks once the UK price is available. In the meantime, I'd love to know which one you'd go for, at least on first impressions, by leaving a comment down below. And if you're new here and you want to see that video as soon as it goes live, then hit subscribe and I'll see you then.